I'm delighted to welcome Professor Fiona Mathews from the University of Sussex, who will be our speaker for today. Fiona started out working on bats as a volunteer about 25 years ago. She is now a professor of environmental biology at the University of Sussex and a chair of the newly founded organization Mammal Conservation Europe. Finding practical solutions to conservation problems and translating these into policy forms a major part of her research group's work. And current projects tackle challenges including wind energy development, light pollution, and road construction. Today, she will be talking about to us about roads, railways, and renewable energy, and the implications of infrastructure for bats. So welcome very much, Fiona, and please take it away.
Thank you, Alyssa. Well, hello everybody, and lovely to be with you talking about issues that have occupied a lot of my research time over the past 10 years or so. We have to remember that the world is changing very, very rapidly. So my great-grandfather was a farmhand and spent a lot of time tending horses. And around the same time, it was really when the first steam cars were just being invented. And at that time, in the UK at least, you used to have to get somebody to walk in front of you, waving a red flag as you went down the road, because the thing was so novel and so apparently dangerous that you had to warn other people to get out of the way. Fast forward only about 150 years. So how many generations is that for a bat? Not very many. And you're at this situation here, at least in northwestern Europe and the USA, where we have multi-lane highways crisscrossing our countries. And just the rapidity, the scale of this change, I think is illustrated really nicely in this map, which is actually showing changes in light pollution, a lot of light pollution being associated with roads. And even if you just flip between 1992 there and 2010, you can see the scale of the change that's happening, and also note the new regions, the expansion out from Northwest Europe. If we zoom out to a global scale, and again, just starting to think about light, well, you can see that obviously most of the light is focused across North America, Northwest Europe, India, Southeast Asia, with relatively dark areas remaining across much of Africa and much of South America. And that corresponds essentially to where road density is lowest. And so perhaps a really alarming thought is actually most of the development over coming years in both roads, electricity production, other sorts of infrastructure is actually going to be in countries in the global south. And this is a recent paper from Science that was looking at the ecological value of currently roadless areas and highlighting the dangers of the massive expansion that we're about to see in infrastructure. And I think this conflict between sustainable development goals is a really interesting problem. So on the one hand, obviously we want fair and equitable societies, we want sustainable cities, we want affordable clean energy, and at the other hand, we need to protect life on land. And those two things sort of often occupy different segments of how we might think about sustainable development, and bringing them together can be quite a conflict. It's also a tricky thing. My personal experience is that lots of people who are interested in sustainable development, thinking about things like sustainable cities or thinking about carbon footprint, actually don't really want to engage with the negative implications that these things might have for wildlife conservation, because it muddies the story. The media is most comfortable with stories that are very straightforward, where you've got a single narrative. And as soon as you say, oh, well, actually, there's a bit of a problem here, then the conversation becomes muddled and people tend to back off and not want to engage with it. So I think, you know, for us as conservation biologists, it's up to us really to keep the pressure on and make sure that when developments like these happen, which we know that they need to happen, that they're done in a genuinely sustainable way that includes wildlife as part of that conversation. Now, when we think about infrastructure development, we've probably all got in our minds things like this. So we're thinking about these really major developments affecting large areas of land. But it's worth bearing in mind that actually the issues associated with infrastructure do trickle down. So it's not just these major trunk roads that might affect the environment. In fact, in terms of road length, at least in Northwest Europe, I'm sure that this must be true elsewhere in the world, the trunk roads, the dual carriageways, the motorways, actually make up a really tiny fraction, about 2% of all roads. Major roads about 9%, and all the rest of it is the minor roads. Okay, so these are the little roads that are connecting suburban areas and so on. And if we look at how much traffic goes on each of these different sorts of roads, again, you've got substantial amounts of traffic, about a third travelling along these minor restricted to the major highways. Now, when we're considering the effects of these infrastructure developments, quite reasonably, a lot of attention focus on lethal effects, and particularly with our interest in bats, the issue for bats is they're very long-lived, they breed slowly, and therefore lethal effects can have very significant impacts on population viability. However, there are also a suite of other effects, non-lethal effects. So these could include things like the energetic cost of moving out of the way of an oncoming vehicle in order to avoid collision. They could be issues like the separation of populations into separate units that don't mix, and so then you have impacts on inbreeding and gene flow. And there can be other sorts of permanent effects. So if your bats, for example, are unwilling to cross a major road, maybe then you're blocking them off, blocking off access to resources that they need, like hibernation sites or foraging sites or mating sites. Now, in this talk today, I'm going to focus largely on lethal effects, but I will touch on these other ones as well. And I'm going to particularly think about ways in which we've been developing monitoring systems and think a little bit about how those might be applied elsewhere in the world. Okay, so lethal effects. We've did a review some years ago now looking at reports of casualties found on roads, and managed to find information on 772 casualties. This is published in Mammal Review. And the take-home message was that being a low-flying species substantially increased risk of collision. Okay, so roughly 65% of all reported casualties are low-flying species, whereas a much smaller fraction were mid-level flyers or high flyers. And that sort of makes sense, doesn't it, that you'd expect low-flying species to be in the collision path of vehicles, and to some extent it might help us to predict what species are likely to be impacted by roads elsewhere. And over recent years, there have been a number of new studies coming out from across the world. So most of our data in that initial review was from Europe and North America. There are increasing number of studies elsewhere. So this is a nice study just published earlier this year, which finds 773 casualties over a 25-kilometre stretch of road over 5 years in Brazil. Okay, and one of the interesting things to me about it is if you look at the proportions of different species found in these road casualties, a lot of them, so about a third, are narrow space frugivores. So a lot of the phyllostomid bats, for example, I suppose they're a very speciose group. They actually formed a significant fraction of the total species, and also a significant number of the total records, so around 18% of the total records. Okay, so you've got seed dispersing bats. You also have casualties of nectar eating bats. So these are species which are really, really important in the delivery of ecosystem services like forest regeneration being affected by these roads. almost half of all the casualties were narrow space species, largely insectivores. And one of the things that intrigued me about the finding from this study is the most frequently found species out of all this very long list of all the different species that there are. Most of them were, or the highest number was actually molluscid bats, which I find a little bit perplexing, given that they're obviously narrow-winged, high-flying species. And I presume what must be happening is those animals are actually dropping. They drop a considerable distance when they're first taking off, when they're emerging from the roost, so maybe they're dropping out and into the path of oncoming vehicles. And the reason I think it's interesting to highlight this is I think otherwise it's very easy for us just to dismiss certain groups of animals as not being at risk of collision, because we think we've sorted everything out on the basis. And to me, what this is saying is you've got a species adapted for fast, high flight, and yet nevertheless it's at high risk. Okay. So yeah, there's been a recent review of another 414 deaths. This is again in Brazil across all the different biomes, and again found this mixture with a lot of the species affected being insectivorous and frugivorous species. Okay. So moving on to thinking about wind energy for a bit, and obviously I could have a webinar series done that before or not, but anyhow, this, particularly in the light of the recent COP26 summit, there is a real move to increase the amount of renewable energy, and for very good reasons. The world needs to reduce carbon emissions. It's interesting, though, that the manifesto presented by the wind energy industry to 26 barely managed to mention nature or biodiversity at all. And again, you end up in these difficult situations where you find yourself rather aligned when raising any concerns about wind industry. You get pigeonholed alongside some of the loony brigade who just don't want any sort of renewable energy and think fossil fuels is fine. And it kind of prompted when I published a paper, this ended up in one of the newspapers in the UK, rather marvellous picture. Anyway, wind power installation in Northwest Europe seems to be slowing down a bit onshore, partly because of objections from local communities and partly because a lot of the good wind energy sites have already been used, and instead there's a focus on offshore development. But across the rest of the world, wind energy installation is continuing apace. Huge installations in China and other countries, Brazil, for example, also being very important. And if we just move to Africa, the African Development Bank has put renewable energy at the top of its high 5 priorities. Okay, so this is coming. It may be indeed that at the moment, most renewable energy, and particularly wind energy, is focused either in North Africa or in South Africa, but undoubtedly over the coming years, this is going to spread across the continent. And at the moment, it's been estimated that about 1% of the potential capacity in Africa has actually been installed. So this is going to increase hugely over time. This is just the current trajectory, showing you different countries and their contributions. Okay. And to give you some idea of the places that have most potential here, the highest potential areas are marked in red, with other areas still down to good potential are in blue. So you can see a lot of the continent has pretty good potential for wind. And with the increasing development of more efficient turbines and turbines with bigger blades, we're now seeing wind energy installations appearing not just in the typical very windy areas, but also in areas with lower wind resource. And that really is quite a concern for 2 reasons. One is that the blade lengths are bigger, so that's presenting a bigger rotor swept area, which is a risk to bats. And secondly, we know that most casualties of bats at wind farms are associated with relatively low wind speeds. So basically, bats don't like flying in gales, right? So the more we put wind energy developments in places with lower wind, the more likely it is that we're going to be impacting on bat populations. And just to give you some idea of global offshore capacity, the bits outlined in red are really the areas of the world which are likely to see a lot of offshore wind development in the future. This is a real concern in northwestern Europe because of the migration of bats across the sea, and it will also be an issue in other parts of the world as well. And a lot of these coastal developments are likely to have bats where there's some foraging offshore. So I want to think a little bit about how we actually go about monitoring bat casualties, thinking both of wind and road and railway installations. And you would think, wouldn't you, that it would have been very obvious that bats were being killed in their thousands at places like this, the Altamont Pass in the USA. And in fact, it wasn't obvious, and it took years and years of monitoring of raptor collisions before anybody started to cotton on to the fact that actually there are dead bats there as well. And the reason that it takes so long is, unlike a raptor, bats are small, they're difficult to see, they disappear very quickly amongst the vegetation, and you just don't get that many of them at any particular turbine. Okay, so if we think about the processes that we have to consider when we're estimating the impacts of turbines, along comes our bat. Okay, we now have one dead bat. Okay, now there's a fair probability that that bat is going to get eaten by something, either by a raptor, by crows, or they get pulled down very quickly into vegetation by burying beetles. And I've been amazed at the speed, even in the UK, the speed with which bats disappear. I mean, basically, sometimes within a day or a day and a half, that carcass is gone, or more or less gone. Come to that in a minute. Okay, so we're only actually going to have a fraction of the total number of casualties available for us to see. And the longer the period between our searches at the turbines, the lower that proportion is going to become. So one of the things that's really important to do at a wind energy site is, if you're doing, or at a road site, is you need to estimate how fast casualties are being removed. I should have said on roads, there's the extra complication of bats also being picked up on car tyres and just disintegrated, or they're moved away from the area. So you need to do your surveys as quickly as you can, basically in the morning, and also try not to have really long intervals between searches, because if you're only going out once a week, for example, then it's very likely that any animals that were killed within the first, I don't know, 1 to 5 days will already have gone by the time you even get there. Then the next issue is, how good are you as an observer at actually finding the bats? So we've already established other animals are going to have removed a lot of them. You come along, you try and see how many bats are there. How good are you at doing that? Now, for my sins, I and some fairly willing PhD students who were paid in chocolate undertook a project to actually compare how good we were, or to establish how good we were at finding bats. And we walked transects, went up and down and up and down. And I can tell you that after about the first half hour, everybody was beginning to lose the will to live. And it's really difficult to keep focused and actually find bats against background vegetation. Okay. Another issue we have to take into account is, often you can't actually search the entire area. So in the case of a wind turbine, it might be quite easy to search, say, the gravel area where vehicles parked, but a lot of these will have things like felled trees around them, or they might be on the edge of a very steep bank that you can't go down for safety reasons. In the case of a road, there might be very tall vegetation on the side of the road, so you can only actually survey on the tarmac and so on. And you also have to think about what fraction of the total at-risk area are you surveying. So if you've got a wind energy installation with, I don't know, 80 wind turbines, chances are you're going to be surveying about 5 or 6 of them in a day, is all you can reasonably do, unless you've got a small army with you, and most wind energy companies aren't willing to pay for small armies. Similarly, if you're assessing road casualties, you're only going to be able to survey a tiny fraction of the total area at risk. Okay, now the reason why it's important to to take this into account is it makes a really big difference to your numbers of casualties that you're going to estimate. Okay, so just as an example here, if you've got doubled your searcher efficiency because you've used a search dog rather than a person, then it can radically alter the maximum numbers of casualties that you're estimating. Okay, so in other words, you can be more precise about your estimates the better your searcher efficiency becomes. And there's a particular issue if you find no casualties at all, because if you don't see anything, then you can't do just a simple adjustment of saying, okay, I'll multiply. I know that I only see half the bats that are there, so I'll double the number. Obviously, if you start off with 0, you can't just double 0 because you still get to 0. Okay, so what you have to do is you can apply pieces of software. There's a couple available now. One is evidence of absence, which will come up, use Bayesian techniques to come up with the plausible maximum number of individuals that might have been killed at a particular site. And again, just going back to why searcher efficiency is important, the problem with evidence of absence or any of these approaches is it can give you a really high upper estimate, which can be quite difficult for policy makers or practitioners. So if you say the number of killed bats could be anywhere between 0 and 250, that's obviously not terribly useful for policy making. Whereas if you've got a tighter limit, then you've got something a bit more tangible to work with. And similarly, if you do observe casualties, the tighter your confidence intervals, the more useful your data are going to be. There's another piece of software called GenEst, which the most recent evaluation, compare it with evidence of absence, suggests that it's probably going to be a bit better in most circumstances. So that's something that I'm going to be moving over to using. Okay, just to give you, everybody likes the video of a dog. This is one of our search dogs. I ended up with well, we've had 8 search dogs operating at one stage. So basically all our search dogs were trained by a police search dog handler. I think a lot of people think, oh, I've got a pet and it'd be quite fun to have them being a search dog. What I think something important to understand is that the selection process is really important with search dogs, and this is true whatever purpose you use them for. So all of ours have been sourced one way or another from rescue centres, and they're normally basically obsessive compulsive dogs that have a really, really massive desire to retrieve a ball. And so they're willing to work all day for that reward of a game. And I think there's a difference between training a dog to work systematically all day, today, tomorrow, the next day, the next day, the next day, compared with most dogs could be trained to be a search dog, to respond to a scent, to find a dead bat or whatever it is you're looking for, otter, drugs. The question is, will they do it over and over again? Or actually, after they've done it twice and they've got to play with the ball, is that going to be enough for them? Okay, but basically what we did is we compared our efficiency as human observers with the efficiency of dogs. We did quite a large scale project comparing our efficiency, and basically we find that we found bats about 1/3 of the time, whereas dogs are finding them 75 to 80% of the time. So they're certainly much, much better than we are. And the other critical thing is that they're a lot faster. Now, of course, there will be circumstances in the world where search dogs aren't going to be your most appropriate solution. So, for example, in countries that are extremely hot, it might be difficult unless you can do your searches extremely early in the morning. So, you know, I'm not saying that search dogs are the only way to do it, but what you would need to do in that circumstance is everything in your power to maximise the efficiency of your observers. So think about, is it possible to clear the vegetation as far as possible before you start of your survey window, so that you've actually got a reasonable chance of seeing what it is? Whereas if you're wading through knee-high or waist-high vegetation, your probability of finding a dead bat, even if it's there, is tiny. And just to come back to the point about increasing blade length in wind turbines, you know, now we always used to operate to a search radius of about 50 meters, but now wind turbine blades are getting so long that actually that search radius doesn't make sense. You need a much bigger radius, and the further you go from the turbine tower, generally speaking, the harder that habitat is to survey, because it hasn't been manipulated. It doesn't have the road in it, it doesn't have the parking area like this. It's all horrible to survey. Okay. But anyway, if this is just an example of some of the bats that our search dogs found, and they're able to find remarkable things like just little bits of bone that are left. We've had, you know, tiny bits of wings sticking up from the earth, and they've been able to find them. So with that, we can come up with estimates of the numbers of fatalities that we have per year. So in this project that I led in the UK with 48 wind turbine sites, we're able to come up with some estimates of how many bats are affected. And those equated for the species most heavily impacted, so common and soprano pipistrelles, probably around 0.4 to 0.3% of the total population estimate, and in the case of nocturnal bats, about 0.4%. And those sorts of rates of casualties, so that what that's translating in terms of numbers of the observed individuals is quite a lot of our turbines, we don't observe anything. These are the numbers of fatalities that we've observed in a month. So it's going up between 0 and 5 per month. And listening to lots of talks from colleagues from across the world, those seem to be about right in terms of numbers of observed bat casualties. So you can see if you're looking for between 1 and 5 bats a month per turbine, that's a lot of search effort in order to identify them. And even though those numbers appear small, the impacts can actually be massive. One finding from our study that I thought was worth flagging up is we didn't find any obvious pattern between how many turbines there are at a wind energy facility and the per turbine casualty rate. So in other words, it didn't seem either that bats are avoiding the area and weren't being killed because perhaps it's a big site and it's very noisy, and nor did it seem that smaller ones were proportionally at higher risk, small wind energy installations. So this is what the pattern looks like, no pattern really, which kind of makes planning fairly straightforward in as far as we can say for every turbine that you add to a site, you're making a proportional increase in the risk. So the risk scales basically with the size of the site, which I think is quite useful. Okay, so beyond saying more turbines and bigger turbine blades are probably bad, what else can we say in terms of risk? And we touched on this earlier when I was talking about the road casualties. We would expect by and large that species that are designed for high flying, so you know the thin narrow winged species, the long range echolocators like in Europe, nocturnal bat, are going to be at high risk, and that's what we've seen. But we also find a lot of casualties of these highly generalist species. So in our case, Pipistrellus pipistrellus and Pipistrellus pygmaeus and Nathusi, all of them can fly at a range of different heights. They've got sort of intermediate wing loadings. They can operate in edge habitats, and we're getting a lot of casualties of those. In North America, it seems like most of the risk seems to be among the long-distance migratory tree bats, things like the hoary bat, for example. Okay, and so I think it's very important when we're considering how to evaluate these impacts in different parts of the world that we recognise that different things might be going on in different places. So we don't have in Europe, we don't seem to be observing a lot of the patterns that are being seen in North America in terms of timings of peak collisions and things like that. So we seem to have slightly different processes going on. And again, just coming back to the road case, we've got this issue where Molossus was the most commonly killed species, whereas we might have otherwise predicted it'd be things like these low-flying species. Okay, so can we predict what the risk is going to be ahead of time? Because obviously this is the principle on which all environmental impact assessments, that at least all the big infrastructure projects should be going through. Can we basically avoid the problems through good placement of our infrastructure? And it turns out, sadly, that this is somewhat harder than we might have hoped it would be. There is actually a wind turbine through here, but it's all a bit murky, just like pre-construction EIAs, really. So what we did is we looked at 29 assessments that had been conducted pre-construction, and we compared them with what we actually found at the site when we followed them up. And what we had was that 62% had concluded that there wasn't any risk to bats, fine to go ahead with the installation as planned, but half of those actually turned out to have casualties, and the rates vary between 1 and 64 bats a month. Okay, so there's significant problems. We found that basically the perception of risk didn't predict bat casualty rates post-construction. And what was even worse, really, is that the perception of risk when the surveys were done, these are acoustic surveys done before construction, didn't correspond with activity at the site after the turbines were built. So that was all a bit of a worry, really. And so we looked at the same sort of question, saying, okay, can we predict casualties on the basis of activity and habitat composition around the site once the thing is built? And it turns out that even that in our very large scale projects seem to be rather tricky. So in the case of bat acoustic activity, what we could say is, well, yes, there's some relationship, but basically all it was useful for is screening out sites that basically had almost no activity into saying, okay, they're at low risk. Any places that had moderate to high activity, they could either have no casualties or they could have a lot of casualties, which from the point of view of a policy making framework is not that helpful. Similarly, if we looked at the predicted value of there being broadleaf woodland within a buffer area of the zone, we looked at this for a few species. So for noctule, for example, we looked at, was the presence of the woodland predictive of whether casualties would occur? Or conversely, how good was the absence of woodland at predicting the absence of a risk, the negative predictive value? So what we find is this is quite useful for noctules, but for common soprano pipistrelles, it wasn't really very useful at all. So it brings you back to that problem, that chestnut of a conservation problem, is it rather depends what species you're trying to conserve. So perhaps if you only had a focus on noctules, this could be useful, but if you're interested in a broad suite of species, maybe not so much. Now, you'll remember that I said that bat activity at the turbine site was difficult to relate to casualty rates, and particularly pre-construction. And there'd been talk for quite a while about possibly bats being attracted to wind turbines. So we decided to investigate this in some more detail. This is work led by a PhD student of mine, Suzanne Richardson. And what we did is we compared bat activity at turbines with a control site, which was very similar. It's in terms of the habitat, so it had to be matched, but one had a turbine there and one was a control. So we had 433 paired detector sites across many, many different turbine sites. And we ended up with about 40,000 pipistrellus calls, of which about 2/3 were common pipistrelle. And we got about 70% of the calls overall were at the turbines and 30% were at the control sites. And what we find is that for common pipistrelle, but not for soprano pipistrelle, basically there was more activity, there was more passes per night at the turbine than at the control. Now, the eagle-eyed among you might have said, okay, hang on, if we look at the scale bar here, we're looking at very low pass rates per night, and maybe that difference isn't that significant, that important biologically. Well, it turns out that if you split the data up into centiles, and this is something we've set up an online system called EcoBat, where you can compare your activity rate, your acoustic data, with data collected at other sites. So you can then say, okay, my site is in the top 10% of activity compared with other similar sites, or it's in the bottom 20% of activity. So if we split it like that and look at what's going on nights of high activity, what we find is that the frequency of high activity nights was very much greater at turbines than it was at the control, okay? Whereas there was much less difference in these in the lower activity nights. So basically what it's saying is a lot of our turbine sites, at least in the UK, are in places which you wouldn't ordinarily think to be marvellous sites for bats, because basically they've already been screened out during the EIA process. So hopefully most of the places where these turbines are going to go are going to have fairly low levels of bat activity most of the time. They're going to be fairly unsuitable habitat, but there will be times when you get high levels of activity there. These will be warm nights, quite calm conditions, perhaps when there's been an egg hatch of a particular prey species and so on. And under those conditions, there's a lot more activity around the turbine than there is at the control. And it's probably because those turbines are acting as a focus of activity. Okay, so I just wanted to think a little bit more about what this means for how we predict risk, because basically what we're saying is that very often what you measure before construction might not be a great predictor of what happens after construction. And the same could be true on roads as well, where you've altered the habitat structure surrounding your road. And it means that if you make, there's been a lot of work done trying to use species distribution modelling approaches as a mechanism for identifying high and low risk areas. And what I'd say about that is, I think that's useful as a screening tool to get rid of very high risk areas, but I would go really cautiously before you assume that a place is low risk. And the reasons are because A, your activity might vary before and after construction. Secondly, we know that species distribution models are difficult if your underlying data are bad. And we know that for many parts of the world, we've got real data deficiency. So we don't even really know what's there or how the presence or absence is related to the environmental predictors. We also know that species distribution models do just what it says on the tin. They predict species distribution. They're not intended, and nor do they, predict abundance. Okay, so if you've got a generalist species, which is basically common and is not strongly tied to one particular habitat type, and this is exactly what we found in the UK, it's our most common and widespread species that are most affected, I would argue that species distribution models are going to be of fairly limited value. Okay, so again, just to be really clear on this, if you've got a really rare species with particular ecological niches, or you're trying to predict just where their migratory routes are or something, could be valuable. But I think just tread very carefully, because for lots of species, this is not going to be a good way of getting the information that you need. Okay. I'm just going to spend a few minutes thinking about some of the non-lethal impacts. So if we just go back to roads, for example, okay, and it struck me it would be interesting to know, we already had evidence that bat activity is altered on roads. So there's some evidence of bat activity declining as you approach roads, but equally some other papers, it's a little bit confusing. So some other papers suggest that actually there can be pretty good habitat alongside roads, and bats will forage up and down the edge of the road. It really depends on the management and the circumstance. So we decided to have a go, this is with a PhD student, Donald Finch. We decided to have a go at unpicking what, if any, was the impact of the noise specifically, as opposed to any of these habitat effects, which might be either increasing or decreasing the attractiveness of an area to bats. And what we did was a playback experiment where basically we recorded sound of a road at dusk on a summer's evening and played it back on a loop, projecting it through speakers at the same amplitude that it had been recorded. And we did this along features that we knew to be used by bats, but which weren't roads. So basically tree lines, hedgerows, and so on. We created a phantom road, if you like. And we had a number of speakers and a number of microphones. And what we did is we had some nights where we had, which were the controls to start with, and then we had some noise nights, which were the treatment nights. And we also had separate control sites where nothing changed. So that this is a backy experiment setup. The long and short of it was that bat activity basically fell off a cliff. This was a replicated experiment. We did it across 2 years. We looked at, in total, I think it was 22 different sites, and basically we find this massive reduction in bat activity. Okay. In the second year, we actually separated out the sonic and ultrasonic components rather than playing them back together, which is what we've done in the first year. And we were quite surprised to find that most of the effect, most of the reduction in bat activity was attributable to sonic noise rather than to ultrasound. Now, initially that was a surprise, but it does sort of correspond with work that's been done in a marine environment, showing in cetaceans that actually the disturbance effect from things like pile driving and other sorts of underwater noise, they don't necessarily have to overlap with the frequencies that the animals are using themselves. So it's not that it's a blocking of ultrasound that's the problem. It's more that actually this is just really annoying to have this noise in the background. Maybe it's distracting, I don't know, aversive in some way. And we also know that although obviously bat ears hearing systems are much more tuned into higher frequencies than are ours, and they have less sensitivity in the lower frequency range, there is some overlap. So certainly the frequencies that we were playing back do fall within the spectrum of sound that is readily audible to bats. If you think about that, that makes sense. You know, we can hear social calls of bats, can't we? Having established that in this effect on roads, we then thought it'd be kind of cool to have a look what was going on with rail traffic, because unlike roads, where there've been quite a lot of studies looking generally at the impact of roads, there's much less work done on railways, beyond saying that actually probably railway habitats are often fairly good environments for bats, particularly if the surrounding habitat is quite unfavourable. So what we did was basically measured on real railway lines bat activity. We recorded the passage of the trains using acoustic microphones, and we listened to the bats using ultrasonic microphones. And what we did was we looked at bat activity in a short window just before the train arrived, which is here to the left. And we also looked, if you imagine the train's going this way, we also looked in the period after the train had gone. So that's when the train's gone by, what were your bats doing now? And for our control period, we thought the most sensible bit would be equidistant between the before and after period. So it's a between period. This should be sort of baseline, if you like. And this is what we find. If you should have said, we can alter the size of these windows. Now, depending on the rail traffic rates on any particular railway, sometimes if there's very busy traffic, we could only actually make these windows about 30 seconds long, okay? The maximum we managed to go up to is, I think, 1.5 minutes long for each of those segments. And obviously you'd expect that if you make these segments long enough, if there's really long intervals, any immediate effects from the train going would decline. And that's exactly what we found. So with the shorter time intervals, 30 seconds or so, this is comparing before the train arrives to the control period between, and there's basically no difference, but you do get a very marked reduction in the incident rate ratio of either comparing after the train has gone to the control or after compared with before, okay? As these time periods go up, so now we've got a 240-second interval that we're looking at, so we're looking at an interval between trains of 720 seconds. You're getting slightly larger confidence intervals, but still the same sorts of patterns apply. What does all that mean? Well, as other people have shown, basically we were finding high activity, so railway environments seem to be fairly good, at least in these highly managed landscapes. But we're getting a 30 to 50% decrease in pipistrelle bat activity for around 20 to 60% of the time available. And what we think is probably the cost to the bats is that there's an energetic cost of repeatedly having to move out of the way of the train. And the reason why I think this is interesting is most focus at the moment is purely on lethal effects, or to some extent on habitat loss effects that might come from railway construction or road construction. But actually, increase in railway traffic or in road traffic, which doesn't get an environmental impact assessment, could also have really important implications for bat conservation. Okay. Let's go touch briefly on the lights again, because they are so frequently associated with particularly roads and to a lesser extent railways. I think we have talked previously about lighting, so I'm not going to say too much about this, other than to say the light from a main road is massively brighter than anything natural from a full moon or from starlight. And we know that bat activity of a great many species, these are just some, are really strongly affected by lighting. And when we come to model this was work where we were looking at movements of bats through a landscape, you can see really clearly how these triangles are the presence of street lights. They're really affecting the connectivity of the landscape for bats. And it kind of draws into question whether we could use this sort of mapping approach to actually identify particular street lamps that we could take out of the system and thereby restore connectivity. I think it's also worth thinking a little bit about the context of lighting, because basically if you put one light into an already light environment, your additional light doesn't make that much difference. Okay, whereas when you put a light into a very dark environment, it is likely to have a much larger biological effect. And we know that from all sorts of experiments, for example, on moths and looking at distances that they'll fly to a light is much greater in a dark sky area than in a very light polluted area. And this is some work we did looking at greater horseshoe bats, and found that when you put a light into a minor road, bat activity really fell very substantially compared with the activity that's measured when there is no light, so in a dark environment. Okay, whereas the A roads and the B roads had much less bat activity to start with, and it seemed like adding a light in this already usually fairly light environments didn't do so much. Okay, so alongside those effects of light and how that may act as a barrier in the landscape to many bat species, not all, there are a few that will exploit light, moths around lights, obviously, but for most species, light comes at a considerable cost. There's also costs of habitat loss associated with infrastructure development. So this is Scotland, this is Brazil, and in both cases you can see big areas of forest are being clear-felled to make way for wind parks, having the same across much of the world for the creation of solar parks, a lot of concern about clearance of natural vegetation, and of course the same for the construction of major roads. And of course one of the problems that major roads bring is it's not just the direct loss of the clearance for the road itself, but it's also the fact that once you put roads through an area, then you're opening up the landscape for other activities such as illegal logging activity, basic penetration of people further and further into natural habitats. So what can we do about this? The habitat loss is a really difficult one, and I'm not going to offer a solution to that now, but I am going to think a little bit about how we might mitigate for other aspects of infrastructure development. In Northern Europe, quite a lot of effort has been put into trying to create wildlife crossings. I actually travelled under this stretch of road at the weekend, and my teenage daughter said, "Mum, what on earth is that over the road?" And I said, "Aha, they're the bat bridges." And she said, "Who on earth thought that would work?" And I have to agree, because this is a case where these are gantries, and what's happened is the trees on either side of the road have been cleared right back, so there's now this huge buffer strip, and really no connectivity at all to help bats find this feature, even were they inclined to follow a feature of what's effectively just a few strings with a bit of net between it. So this has basically caused furore in the UK, where there've been all sorts of bridges like this, and a lot of complaints about how much money is wasted on stuff that's only for wildlife anyway, so they say. So how can we do this better? I think this is a really nice paper that was published earlier this year in Portugal, where there was a study done and finding roughly 3 casualties of bats per kilometre a year. So that's 500 and odd bat casualties were found, which is quite remarkable over the period of the study. And what they're able to show was that there were hotspots for casualties that accounted for about 12% of the network, but those hotspots accounted for about 60% of all the casualties, and they're shown as these little markers here. Now, the sad thing is that a lot of the hotspots move around, so they're not stable between years. And this is a problem, because if you're wanting to put an expensive structure in place, an underpass perhaps, or a bridge, you really need to know where to put it, and you don't want your animals to be moving up and down and crossing all over the place. But they did manage to identify 3% of the network, which is shown in green on the map, that was stable. And if you're able to mitigate effectively just there, that would mitigate for about 27% of the casualties. Okay. I think another thing we could be doing is thinking more about the heights at which bats are crossing roads. So thinking about how that relates to local vegetation structure, for example, thinking about putting hopovers in roads that are going to try and lift the height of the bat so it carries on at a safe distance. So this is some work that one of my PhD students is doing at the moment, where we're using infrared imagery, and these are marker posts on the side, these are fluorescent markers here, to look at the flight height of barber-style bats. So you can see that a lot of the flight is actually out of the way of traffic because it's above the height of the marker post, but then you get some other individuals which are coming down and appear to be foraging at much lower levels. So I think we need to make use of technologies like that to help us understand what's going on. We can also say with a reasonable degree of confidence that the bigger the bridges are, the more effective they're likely to be. So green bridges like this are probably going to have the greatest likelihood of success. The problem is that because they're expensive, you're going to get relatively few of them along any stretch of road. So I think we need to also be looking at ways in which we can try and funnel our bats towards the structure that we want them to use. So that might be, for example, even the introduction of lighting in places where you don't want them to cross, or the provision of really good vegetation that funnels them towards the place that you'd like them to use. In terms of noise, I think we need to be thinking a lot more about this. One of the things I hadn't appreciated until I started to talk to sound engineers was, at the moment, when people model the environmental impact of noise, they only go to usually 50 meters from the road, whereas the noise that we're talking about, which includes a lot of the lower frequency noises, actually will travel very, very much further than this. And the reason that's important is the main mitigation for road noise, which can be very effective, is to put in a barrier. So you have your source here, a soundproof barrier, and it will reflect a lot of the sound back, which is great, and it'll absorb some as well, with only a little bit being transmitted through to the house or the bats or whatever that are over here. But there is a bit of an issue in that noise is also diffracted. Okay, so you can get noise coming like this from the source and just carrying on and moving across the landscape. So in this sort of scenario where you've got a soundproof barrier like this, these houses are probably fine because they're down in a dip. But over here where we're going up a hill, then if that hill continues, the hill itself is going to be a bit of a barrier to anything if there was a dip over the other side. But if you just carry on going up, that is not going to screen in any way the propagation of that sound. And that's why when you stand on hillsides, if there's a road below you, you can hear the road noise really, really clearly. So I think that needs a lot more thought. I'm just going to finish with wind turbines, because to my mind, the key thing that we need to be doing is really pushing for the minimization of blades turning below the point when they're even generating electricity, because this is known as feathering the blades. Because at the moment we have thousands of turbines across the globe that are turning, even though they're not generating a single watt of electricity, and killing bats as they do it. We need to stop that. And secondly, we also need to look at curtailment, which means actually altering the wind speed at which the blades start to turn and generate electricity. In places where we have an issue with bat casualties, we need to be going and having those conversations about implementing curtailment. We know it works. We know it comes at some cost to electricity generation, but what we need to do is make sure we get really good evidence on the ground of what the impacts are and demonstrate to a wide stakeholder community that this is an effective method by which we can get green energy and also protect our bats. Thank you. I can't make it stop there. Thank you, Alyssa.
Thanks very much, Fiona. That was incredible. I mean, great talk and a fantastic overview of how different types of infrastructure can impact on bats in very different ways. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat. If we're running a bit short on time, but if you have to leave, feel free to leave. We'll stay here for a few minutes trying to get through some of the questions. I'll start just by reading out a question from Eleanor asking whether or not you looked at the activity of bats around the trains. Did you take the massive buffeting of air around the trains into account?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It would be something that would be interesting to measure. I don't know. So we ended up thinking quite long and hard about how to unpick the different elements of train passage and to figure out exactly which are the causal features. And in the end decided that we would, because so little was known, that we would start just by taking an overall view of the train in total, which includes the lights, the noise it's making, the fact that you've got this massive air movement. And at the moment we don't have a way of separating out the effect of the air, and obviously that's going to be particularly important with the implementation of high-speed rail links as well, where your trains are moving much faster, and potentially there could be there's the potential for barotrauma and things like that to start kicking in. So really, I'd see our work as one of the first, just to raise awareness that I think railways are going to have important implications for bats, and we need to understand better what those are.
And how to mitigate them as well, which some of your work has looked into as well.
Yeah.
Great. We have another, lots of comments and thanks for your talk. And we have another question from Julia asking if you've looked at bat casualties around different wind turbine designs, such as the more vertical ones.
Yeah, no, we haven't. We've never looked at the vertical ones, and there's a couple of different sorts of vertical ones. The reason that we haven't is basically there aren't enough of them to really enable us to do a proper study. And it's interesting because quite often they are marketing themselves as bat friendly because they don't have any moving parts. I don't think so far they've been, there doesn't seem to be much of an appetite by energy producers to adopt them. Occasionally they come out and there's a load of publicity about them, but it still seems that the established technology very much has a grip on the market at the moment. So it would be something interesting to look at, but we haven't. We did do a bit of work on smaller wind turbines, which again seem to be declining in how fashionable they are. At one stage, lots of people were putting up small to mid-sized wind turbines, and there was also another project at Stirling looking at the same thing. Basically, we looked at casualty rates and found that it was similar to the big turbines. And Jeroen Minderman from Sterling, he looked at the avoidance and found that bats seemed to be avoiding small wind turbines. So that could also be an important factor. Okay, painting turbine blades, a bit about that. I think what you're thinking of is there was a suggestion that if you painted blades purple, they attracted less insects to them. It got quite a lot of international publicity from what was actually an undergraduate project, which seemed quite remarkable. I suspect it was a little overhyped because what they did, I mean, it was kind of a neat design. What they had was different coloured pieces of card painted in some wind turbine colours, and then they also had purple. And they found that fewer insects, most of which were diurnal, it has to be said, fewer insects were on the purple card compared with the turbine coloured card. So if you assume that one of the reasons bats are at turbines is because they're foraging, then that would help. Yeah, but I think there's lots of other reasons why wind turbines aren't about to be painted purple because of all sorts of visual impact issues.
I've also heard about using lights to try and kind of scare the bats away, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there is talk about that, and there's also been quite a lot of work looking at acoustic deterrents. I think all of these don't seem to be universally successful, and there are issues around the amount of energy, both with acoustic and lighting, how much energy it would take to actually have the scale of coverage that you need for it actually to be aversive. And of course, there are some species that would still go and forage around lights. So yeah. Difficult. And a good comment from Ella, yes, you're right, that they don't always fly high, the melocids. Yeah, you're absolutely right that they can fly low. I think the point I was trying to make was just though, if you solely try to use traits, which obviously as biologists we often turn to that because if we don't have a lot of information, it's a good place to start. Just to say, you know, you just have to be a bit careful about how broadly you draw your conclusions, because yeah, melocids here are clearly clearly a problem with road casualties.
I also wanted to ask, has there been any work thinking about the non-lethal effects, whether it's light or sound, whether or not there's any habituation by the bats? So is it probably a kind of strong effect initially, and then the bats probably get accustomed to it?
I think that is a really interesting question, and particularly with our work on sound. It was something I was very aware of, that we were only doing short scale studies of, you know, maybe a week in a place, and maybe over time they would habituate. It's something that becomes, if you're going to do it as an experiment, it becomes a logistical nightmare, because you've got to have very long periods where you can have your experiments and have those replicated, and you're getting into all the seasonality of bat behavior and all sorts of things. I think it's a good point. It might be best looked at by some sort of meta-analysis, I think. And one of the things I've been trying to push for via Eurobats is that we try and set up an international repository of data that's doing before and after comparisons of bat activity at road sites, for example. Because if you had that, and you had enough sites where monitoring is being done commercially anyway by ecological consultants, if we could actually collate that data, then we could actually start to say whether over time these aversive effects start to reverse and the bats get used to it.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting to just learn more about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems often is that you don't have the same consultants working on sites pre and post construction, and that's a real problem, because all sorts of stuff changes about the method, you know, ranging from where the surveys are done to what sort of bat detectors are used or how many, and yeah, so it becomes quite tricky.
And just to finish off, I guess a more practical question in terms of engaging with companies and the industry. What's your experience been in terms of how willing they are to implement some of the mitigation measures that your research suggests?
It's really challenging. It's really challenging. There are some very good companies, But I think you have to recognise that most energy generation and most road construction companies, they're massive international conglomerations. You know, these are mega corporations whose primary concern is their shareholders. And very often when we were setting up, so, you know, I've now worked at more than 60 wind farms, and very, very often I've had really good experiences of talking to the ecologists who've been working for the company, and they can completely see the point and they're interested and want to do the right thing. And then once it gets to the board, they just think, well, why would we do this? We're just going to lose money. Unless somebody's making us do it, we're not going to do it. So yeah. So I think we need to keep the battle. Those of you on Twitter sphere and social media and the rest of it, keep up the pressure, because I think this green dilemma is a really big issue, and you know, there's a danger that it just gets forgotten about.
So is there a bit more to do in terms of legislation, you think, just to kind of make them do it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I can't see any more questions in the chat, and we're already 10 minutes over our time.
Thank you.
Thank you for a fantastic talk, Fiona, and thanks everyone for coming and for staying during the talk. Have a great day, and we'll welcome you back next year for another series of webinars. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay.